People like you don't belong in a place like this. He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull her aside. Richard Coleman said it loud enough for the entire room to hear his voice, sharp, deliberate, cutting through the polished silence of the Phoenix Grand like a blade through silk. Walker stood completely still, invitation in one hand, her volunteer notebook in the other, 19 years old. And suddenly, the most visible person in a room full of people pretending not to stare. Watching this story unfold, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from to see exactly how far this story has traveled. When Madison had arrived 40 minutes early, was the kind of person she was. Not someone who showed up exactly on time. Not someone who slipped in at the last second and hoped nobody noticed. It was the type who arrived early because she wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly, that no detail fell through the cracks, that nobody else had to scramble because she hadn't done her part. Her mother had raised her to be that way, and her father, whatever people thought about, her father had reinforced it every single day of her life. The Phoenix Grand Hotel hosted roughly a dozen major charity events every year. This event was the Arizona Children's Healthcare Foundation annual gala, a fundraiser that pulled together local executives and business owners, wealthy donors, and a handful of community organizations that had applied to partner with the foundation. Madison's father had submitted their application 6 weeks earlier. The Jackson Walker Community Outreach Foundation had been approved, assigned a table near the eastern wall, and provided 2 official volunteer slots. Madison had taken one of those slots herself. She wore a simple dark green dress she'd bought at a secondhand shop 3 weeks ago. She'd had it dry cleaned. She wore the one pair of heeled shoes she owned, black and slightly worn at the left toe where she'd scuffed them at a previous event. Down. She carried a small notebook because she always carried a small notebook. She liked to write things down, capture moments, remember names, something her father had taught her. You can't keep everything in your head, he'd told her once. Down. People remember that you remembered. The lobby was already filling when she arrived. Waitstaff in white shirts moved through the space with practiced efficiency. Arrangements the size of small trees anchored the room at regular intervals. The quartet played somewhere near the entrance to the main ballroom. The music, elegant and precise and utterly divorced from anything Madison had grown up hearing. She'd grown up with the sound of engines, with laughter that was too loud for the spaces it occupied, with people who called each other brother and meant every syllable of it. She checked in at the volunteer table, received her badge. She confirmed her assignment. She was supposed to assist with guest intake to help direct donors to their tables. Coordinate with the foundation's liaison regarding the community organization's display materials. Simple enough. She'd done similar work at smaller events before. The first 20 minutes, nobody gave her a second look. She was doing her job. She was polite. She smiled at people who didn't smile back. She pointed elderly guests toward accessible seating without being asked. She held doors open and fetched programs from the registration table and answered questions about parking validation. She was good at this. She liked this. There was something satisfying about the work, the invisible infrastructure of an event, the dozens of small decisions that made things run smoothly. Richard Coleman noticed her. She didn't know who he was at first. She saw a man in a charcoal suit moving through the room with the particular energy of someone who believed they owned every space they entered. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with silver at his temples and a kind of deliberate grooming that spoke of routine maintenance and professional vanity, like a man who expected people to step aside, and most of them did. His posture said authority. His expression said judgment. Stopped near the registration desk, and looked at Madison. Not at the guest she was assisting, not at the table. It was the kind of look she'd learned to recognize early, growing up the daughter of a Hell's Angel, in a world that had already decided what that meant before it ever met her father. The downward assessment. The tiny tightening around the eyes that said, You're out of place, and I'm the one who gets to say so. She kept her smile on and returned her attention to the elderly couple she was helping locate their table assignment. Excuse me. Coleman's voice cut across the conversation, not aggressive, yet just entirely unconcerned with the fact that Madison was already talking to someone. Yes, sir? Where did you come from? The elderly woman beside Madison glanced up. The elderly man didn't react, hard of hearing, focused on the table chart. Volunteer with the Children's Healthcare Foundation event, Madison said, evenly. Something I can help you with? You don't look like a foundation volunteer. The words landed in the space between them. Madison held his gaze. My badge, sir. She touched the lanyard at her collar. I can get my volunteer confirmation form if you need it. It's not what I'm asking. What are you asking? He looked her over once more. Something shifted in his expression, and not toward warmth. One of the community groups. Is that right? The Motorcycle Foundation? It was. That word. That particular weight attached to it. She said, my father's foundation is partnering with the event tonight. I'm one of our... This is a private space. He said it the way someone says something they've already decided, something that doesn't require additional information. Community organizations have their own designated area near the east entrance. Volunteers from those groups should stay within their assigned zones. Assigned here by the coordinator. I'll need to see that in writing. Madison blinked. The coordinator verbally. In writing, he repeated. He crossed his arms. Or you'll need to move to the community partner area until this can be verified. The elderly couple excused themselves quietly. Madison watched them go and then turned back to face Coleman with a control she did not entirely feel. I can call the coordinator right now, she said. She can confirm my assignment. Step outside to make a call. That's fine. I'm not trying to step outside. I'm trying to do my job. Job, Coleman said. The slightest emphasis on those two words, a weight of condescension that managed to make a simple noun sound like a verdict. Is in the East Wing with the other partner organizations. Around them, people were beginning to notice. Dramatically, the party hadn't shifted once. The music hadn't stopped, but the particular radar that all social rooms develop, then, that invisible awareness of tension detective had activated. Some turned. Eyes held for a beat too long before looking away. This could feel it, the warmth of a dozen people watching from their peripheral vision. Father. She thought of her father. She thought of the way he moved through rooms like this slowly, without apology, but also without aggression. She thought of what he told her about dignity. You can't let someone else's disrespect become your behavior. It's how they win. My name is Madison Walker, she said. There is Jackson Walker. His foundation is a registered partner for tonight's event. I'm a registered volunteer. I have documentation. I'm happy to get it right now. She kept her voice level, professional. But I'm not going to stand here and pretend I don't understand what you're actually saying to me. Passed through Coleman's eyes, a flicker, quite guilt, something closer to recalculation. I'm saying, he said slowly, that this section of the event is for premium guests and hotel-designated staff. One community group, volunteers, are also staff, are also welcome in their assigned areas, which I'm telling you was assigned to be here. He stared at her for a long moment. He said it, flat, unhurried, with the particular ease of someone who had said similar things many times and faced no consequences for any of them. People like you don't belong in a place like this. Quartet kept playing. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne. Where across the room, two women laughed at something elegant and unremarkable. The world of the party continued on its axis, but in the small territory of space between Madison Walker and Richard Coleman, everything stopped. She didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. Though something hot and specific had climbed into the back of her throat and settled there, waiting. Excuse me, she said. Coleman had already begun turning away, as if the matter were settled, as if her question didn't warrant an answer. I'll have someone escort you to the East Wing. No, the word came out clean and absolute, but with a firmness that made the nearest waiter pause mid-step. To explain what you meant by that. Coleman stopped. Back. His eyebrows lifted, not quite surprise, but the expression of a man recalibrating because his expected sequence of events had been interrupted. I'm not going to have this conversation here, he said. You chose to have it here, Madison said, in front of all these people. So we can finish it here. The room was definitely watching now. Tense of peripheral attention had dissolved entirely. A man in a navy suit, 2 tables over, had stopped his conversation mid-sentence. A woman near the champagne station had turned fully around. Volunteer coordinator, a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Paula, who had checked Madison in 40 minutes ago, was making her way across the room with a look of cautious alarm. Coleman lowered his voice. I suggest you lower your tone. I'm speaking at the same volume I've been using this entire conversation, Madison said. I asked you to explain what you meant. I'm still asking. This is not... Is it because of my dress? Is it because of my name? Is it because of my father? She looked at him steadily. Because I want to know exactly which one of those things made you decide I don't belong here, because every single one of them is wrong. The man's jaw set. Something cold moved into his expression. Your father's name, he said, stripping his voice. Entrance to something that tried to pass for reasonable. One is associated with a motorcycle organization that has a certain reputation. Others Foundation has donated over $40,000 to children's health programs in this state. In the last 4 years, Madison's voice didn't waver. He applied to this event through the proper channels, was accepted, and followed every instruction he was given. He has his family. So have I. And you still decided the moment you saw me that I didn't belong here. It's not about reputation. That's something else. The coordinator arrived. Is everything okay over here? Madison said. She looked at Paula directly. Could you confirm my volunteer assignment, please? Paula looked between them. She had the expression of someone who had walked into the middle of something and already understood she was going to be asked to take a side. Madison is assigned to the main registration area, she said carefully. She's been doing a great job. I personally assigned her here. Coleman looked at Paula. A long beat of charged silence. Then he looked back at Madison. This isn't finished, he said. She answered. He walked away. Madison stood there and breathed. Paula put a hand on her arm and said something low and kind that Madison didn't fully register. It was moving fast. The adrenaline of the confrontation still burning through her in slow waves. She held it together because she had been raised to hold it together. Because breaking down in the middle of a charity event lobby was not who she was and not who she intended to be. She pulled out her phone. She sent her father a single text message. I'm okay, but you should probably come in. Walker had been in the parking lot for 20 minutes. This was a habit of his, arriving early to events and then waiting, giving Madison the chance to be the one walking in through the front door first, not him. Understood what it meant to. Rooms like this, when he walked through the door first, stood the way the air changed. He wasn't naive about it, and he wasn't particularly wounded by it anymore, though there had been years when it had hit differently. He'd grown through it. He'd built something through it. But he still tried when possible to give his daughter the space to be herself before he brought the weight of his history into the room with him. His phone buzzed. He read the message. He read it again. He got out of the car. Jackson Walker was 6'2" and moved the way men move when they've stopped caring about whether they look dangerous and started caring only about whether they're being honest. He wore his Hell's Angels vest over a clean black button-down shirt. His boots were old and well kept. He'd shaved that morning. It was silver and tied back. He was 52 years old, and there wasn't a room he'd walked into where in the last 15 years that hadn't registered his arrival. He walked through the front doors of the Phoenix Grand Hotel. He found Madison immediately, standing near the registration table with Paula, the coordinator, and still upright, still professional, still holding her notebook. But Jackson could read his daughter's posture the way other parents read facial expressions. He'd watched her grow up. He knew the specific geometry of her shoulders when she was pretending to be fine. The way her chin lifted, a precise half-inch when she was containing something she hadn't fully processed yet. He walked toward her. Hey, sweetheart. Hey, Dad. It's all. Just that. But the look she gave him when she said it, the way she exhaled, the way her shoulders dropped a single millimeter, he already knew. Tell me, he asked quietly. There's a manager, she said. He paused, sorted her words. He told me people like me don't belong here. And was quiet for a moment. Paula stood nearby, clearly uncertain about whether to contribute this conversation or excuse herself. Jackson asked, Dad, I'm not going to do anything. He said it simply, as a fact. I want to talk to him. Paula pointed across the room. Coleman was standing near the bar when speaking to another man in a suit on a glass of water in one hand, his posture already recalibrated to comfortable authority. As if the conversation with Madison had been a minor inconvenience he'd long since moved past. Jackson looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at his daughter. He asked, I handled it. Then let's go do it together. He walked across the room, not rushing, not making a spectacle, just walking. The way people walk when they know exactly where they're going. Coleman saw them when they were about 50 feet away and watched the manager's face process the incoming information. The tall man in the leather vest, the girl beside him, and went still the connection between the two and watched something complicated move through Coleman's expression before he reconstructed it into professional neutrality. Mr. Coleman, Jackson said. He didn't extend a hand. He didn't cross his arms. He just stood there, grounded and still and entirely unhurried. Jackson Walker, Madison's father, Mr. Walker. Coleman's chin lifted fractionally. And there was some confusion earlier about your daughter's assignment. There's no confusion, Jackson said. She had a valid assignment. She had documentation. She was doing her job. I was simply following protocol for. You say it? Jackson asked. Coleman blinked. I beg your pardon? You told my daughter that people like her don't belong here. Jackson's voice was completely even. Cold, not aggressive, just precise. Why did you say that to her? The man Coleman had been speaking with when they approached had quietly relocated himself approximately 6 feet to the left. The behind the bar was making himself busy with glasses that didn't need attention. I believe I said. She heard it. Paula heard it. The lobby heard it. Jackson tilted his head slightly. So I'm asking you to explain what you meant, because I'd like to understand the specific logic that led you to tell a 19-year-old volunteer with valid credentials and a legitimate assignment that she doesn't belong in a room. The man's jaw tightened. This is a premium event. He was invited. So was I, so was our foundation. Jackson paused. It again. Another beat of silence, longer this time. May have been a miscommunication. You said the words clearly. Jackson looked at him without animosity, but also without any give at all. So let's talk about what you actually meant, because I don't think it was about her assignment. Coleman looked around the room, calculating. He was clearly a man who knew how to read social dynamics and was currently discovering that this one had shifted away from him in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Mr. Walker, he said, lowering his voice, something that wanted to sound like calm authority, but landed closer to manage his comfort. I think we can both agree that this kind of conversation is better handled privately. You had a very public conversation with my daughter, Jackson said. This one can stay where it is. Across the room, a small cluster of guests had stopped pretending not to watch. Still nearby, a hotel staffer had appeared at Coleman's elbow, uncertain whether he was needed. Madison watched her father. She'd seen him in difficult conversations before. She'd seen him in rooms where people wanted him to be something other than what he was: louder, angrier, more chaotic, something that would confirm what they already believed about him. Gave them that. He just stood in the truth of himself and let the room rearrange around it. My daughter has been a volunteer for our foundation for 3 years, Jackson said. She has never been late, never caused a problem, never embarrassed herself or us or anyone she was working with. Tonight she arrived early, checked in correctly, and was doing her job when you approached her. And instead of asking who she was or verifying anything, You decided based on her name and her background that she didn't belong. Glenn said nothing. That's not protocol, Jackson continued. Choice. And I want to understand why you made it, because I have a feeling this isn't the first time you've made it with someone, and I don't think Madison is the only one who deserves an answer. That last sentence hung in the air, and something in it, the steadiness of it, the implication that this wasn't just about tonight, made Coleman's carefully managed composure show its first genuine crack. Because Jackson Walker had been doing exactly this kind of work for over a decade. Dramatic confrontations, not the leather vest and the intimidation that everyone, when they saw him walk through a door. Meticulous, unyielding kind of accountability that didn't need to raise its voice. The kind that didn't go away. The kind that made people like Richard Coleman realize, too late, that the person they dismissed as irrelevant had been paying close attention the entire time. Madison stood beside her father and watched the manager try to find solid ground. She understood, really understood, in a way she hadn't fully before, that this moment was about so much more than one comment in a hotel lobby. People in this building, who had sat quietly at tables in the East Wing because believed that was where they belonged. Young volunteers who had absorbed the unspoken message that their kind of background didn't earn them the right to take up space in rooms like this. Families and workers and community builders who had learned to make themselves smaller around people like Richard Coleman because the alternative seemed too costly. She wasn't going to be one of them. And her father, standing there in his leather vest in the middle of a room full of people who'd expected him to be something he wasn't, was making sure she never had to be. The conversation wasn't over. Not even close. Richard Coleman was already beginning to understand that the ground beneath his assumptions had just fundamentally shifted. Everyone, and the thing he'd thought would protect him, his authority, his position, certainty about who belonged, where had stopped. Being the advantage he believed. It was the moment. Jackson Walker walked through the front door. The question wasn't what Coleman had said to Madison. The question was what he'd been doing, quietly, in the spaces where he'd held that power much longer than tonight. To that question was about to change everything. Coleman opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Mr. Walker, I've been the regional manager of this property for 11 years. I think I understand the needs of better than what? Jackson said. The sentence just stopped there. Aggressive, not baiting. Just genuinely asking Coleman to finish the thought he'd started, because they both knew how it ended, and Jackson was willing to wait all night for the man to say it out loud. Coleman didn't finish it. He pivoted instead, the way men like him always pivoted toward procedure, protocol. Sounds the institutional language that made personal choices sound like policy. Events have specific standards for guest interaction and volunteer placement, ensuring those standards were maintained. By telling a 19-year-old girl she doesn't belong here, clarifying the proper areas, for she was in the proper area. Jackson's voice stayed even. Paula confirmed that. The documentation confirmed that. You knew that. Before you said what you said, and you said it anyway. He paused. So the question isn't about protocol. The question is about why you decided that my daughter specifically needed to be told she didn't belong when her paperwork was in order and her coordinator had assigned her there. Paula, standing 6 feet away, to be small, gave a an involuntary nod. She seemed surprised by her own reaction and quickly composed her expression back to neutral, but Madison had caught it. The man in the Navy suit who'd strategically relocated himself during the exchange had now drifted an additional 3 feet toward the far end of the bar, practically becoming part of the wall. The hotel staffer, who'd appeared at Coleman's shoulder, had made a quiet executive decision and disappeared entirely. Coleman said carefully, every syllable, that this conversation has escalated beyond what either of us intended, and I'm happy to sit down with your family and the event coordinator to review what happened and address any concerns. I'm addressing them right now, Jackson said. That's what this is. Coleman blinked. He wasn't a man who blinked often in professional settings. Madison noticed it. Right now, Jackson continued, there are other volunteers in this building who've been treated the same way my daughter was treated tonight. Because Madison told me, and Madison doesn't exaggerate. He glanced at his daughter briefly, just a half second, and then returned his gaze to Coleman. I want to know if that's true. I don't know what she may have. Volunteers who were redirected tonight based on the organization they represent. Were community partner volunteers given different treatment than hotel-designated staff volunteers? Has this been your consistent practice at events like this one? Face had gone the particular shade of a man who was doing very rapid internal calculations and not liking any of the numbers coming out. He set his water glass down on the bar behind him, slowly, deliberately, as if the act of placing it carefully gave him an extra second to think. These are very broad questions, he said finally. They have yes or no answers, Jackson Pond replied. And that was when the evening changed direction. Not because of what Coleman said next. He didn't say anything for a long visible moment, but because of who walked through the side door of the ballroom at exactly that moment. A man in his early 60s, silver-haired, in a dark suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and with the particular energy of someone who owned something and was checking on it. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he was the owner of the Phoenix Grand Hotel, sister properties across Arizona, and Winnesing, the man whose signature appeared on the hotel's annual commitment letter to the Arizona Children's Healthcare Foundation. Saw him before her father did. She saw something else too. She saw the exact moment Gerald Marsh's eyes landed on Jackson Walker, and instead of the reaction she'd been bracing for, instead of the tightening of caution she'd seen in 100 faces before, his expression did something entirely unexpected. Jackson. He said it across the room, already moving toward them, already extending his hand. No, you were here tonight. Jackson turned. Single clean second, Madison watched Coleman's face go through about 6 emotions in the span of one breath. Madison shook Marsh's hand. Gerald, good to see you. You too. Marsh's grip was warm and familiar, the grip of a man greeting someone he actually knew. He looked at Madison. And this must be your daughter. Madison, is it? Your father talks about you constantly. I hope you know that. Madison managed a smile. He talks about you too. Marsh laughed. Then he looked between the two men, Jackson, steady and still, and Coleman had gone absolutely rigid, and the laugh faded into something more attentive. All right, over here? We were having a conversation, Jackson said. He looked at Coleman, then at Jackson, then at Madison. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had built a business career on reading rooms. Kind of conversation. Jackson let the silence hold for exactly one beat. Then Madison said, Mr. Coleman told me, people like me don't belong here. It went very still. He turned to Coleman. Coleman opened his mouth, said it was one word, quiet, controlled, and so completely unambiguous that Coleman actually closed his mouth without making a sound. Marsh looked back at Madison. He said that to you, directly, in front of the registration table, in front of guests, Paula. Marsh turned to locate Paula, who was still standing nearby and who gave a single, uncomfortable nod of confirmation when his gaze found her. Coleman began. I was simply, he said. Marsh kept his eyes on Madison for a moment longer, and in them, Madison saw something she hadn't expected from a man she'd never met before tonight. Something that looked a great deal like genuine apology. Then he turned fully to face his regional manager, and whatever had been warm in his expression was gone. My office, tonight. After the event, of course, Coleman said. Clipped, professional. The voice of a man trying very hard to hold the shape of authority, while everything structural beneath it was shifting. Marsh turned back to Jackson. I am sorry, he said. Simple and direct. This should not have happened. It did happen, Jackson said. Not harshly, just honestly. And I don't think tonight was the first time. Marsh held his gaze. What do you mean? What do you mean? I mean, there are other volunteers in this building tonight who were redirected from their assigned positions when they arrived. Community organization volunteers. People who had documentation, had their assignments confirmed, and still ended up in the East Wing wondering why. Jackson paused. It would be worth asking them what their experience was tonight before this building empties out. Marsh looked at him steadily for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, slow and certain. I'll do that. Coleman said nothing. When his hands were still at his sides, his posture was perfectly managed. When all professional composure from the outside, but Madison could see it, the very slight tension in his jaw, it controlled, qualified his breathings, the way his eyes tracked between Marsh and Jackson without landing on either of them for too long. He was doing arithmetic, trying to calculate the damage, and watched him and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not anger, something closer to sadness, because she could see clearly that Coleman wasn't a man who understood why this mattered. When calculating moral exposure, he was calculating professional exposure. When thinking about the volunteers he'd redirected, he wasn't thinking about the volunteers he'd they'd feel like they'd made some kind of mistake by arriving at an event they'd been invited to. Thinking about his position, his record, his standing with Marsh. And that meant he still didn't understand what he'd done. Jackson had told her once years ago that the most difficult thing about confronting someone's prejudice wasn't the confrontation itself, it was the realization that some people could go through the entire process, the exposure, the accountability, the consequence, and come out the other side without ever actually getting it. Understanding that the harm wasn't the policy violation, it was in what they believed about other human beings. Each fatigue. Talked to some of the other volunteers myself, Madison said. So Marsh and Jackson looked at her. If they had similar experiences tonight, she continued, they should be able to say so to someone who's actually going to record it and do something with it. She looked at Marsh. You have someone here who can take their statements. Marsh studied her for a moment. There was something in his expression that had shifted the way adults sometimes look at young people when they've underestimated them, and the young person has just made that very clear. Yes, he said. Absolutely. Thank you. Coleman watched this exchange with an expression that Madison couldn't quite categorize, something between professional dismay and a kind of personal unsettlement that he was visibly trying to contain. He had spent 11 years at the Phoenix Grand. He had managed hundreds of events. He had made thousands of decisions about who belonged, where and under what circumstances, and not one of those decisions had ever been formally questioned. One of them had been examined in the light by a hotel owner and a man in a leather vest and a 19-year-old girl with a notebook, covering what it felt like to be reviewed, continued around them. The string quartet played, ate and drank, and wrote checks. Beautiful. The polished machinery of a charity gala ran exactly as it was designed to run, because the invisible infrastructure of the evening, the volunteers, coordinators, quiet workers who made sure everything happened correctly, was still doing its job. He touched Madison's arm lightly. You want to walk with Isma? She nodded. They moved together across the ballroom, and Madison noticed something as they walked away. Space arranged itself around her father, not with fear, but with the cautious deference she'd seen in so many rooms before, with a kind of attention. People looked at him and then looked again. She'd watched this happen her whole life, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, she was watching the room recalibrate in real time. He asked her, low enough that it was just between them. Okay, she said. Then more honestly, I'm angry. I'm okay. Good. He nodded. Both of those things can be true. You angry when you walked in? I'm always a little angry, he said. Dry. Just almost funny, and she laughed despite herself a short, surprised sound. Angry at the situation, not at him. There's a difference. He glanced at her. You handled yourself well in there. I was shaking the whole time. I know. You still did it. They found Paula near the East Corridor, where she'd gone after the exchange with Marsh and Coleman. She was standing with a young man and two young women, all of them wearing volunteer badges, all of them with the particular posture of people who had been trying to make themselves a manageable size and had been doing it for long enough tonight that it had become automatic. Madison recognized the posture. She'd been wearing it herself less than 30 minutes ago. She said to Paula, routine. And then, more specifically, to the three young volunteers. Can I ask you something? The young man looked at her cautiously. He was maybe 20, with a community center badge clipped to his shirt alongside the volunteer lanyard. Where were you assigned when you arrived tonight? Then main floor, guest services, and where did you end up? At the two young women beside him. Something passed between the three of them, a shared recognition, a quick confirmation of a shared experience. He said, did someone redirect you? Another beat. This time, a man in a suit told us there'd been a mix-up with our assignments. Community volunteers were supposed to be in the east section. He paused. He seemed pretty sure about it. We didn't. He stopped. He calibrated. We didn't really question it. What did he look like? Man, described Richard Coleman without hesitation. Temples, charcoal suit, the particular posture of a man who expected compliance. Young women nodded along as he spoke. Their expressions carrying the specific quiet of people who'd been bothered by something and hadn't had a frame to put around it until right now. I told you there was a mix-up, Madison said. Yeah, her voice was steady. You were assigned where you were assigned. He moved you because he wanted to. The young man stared at her, then at Jackson, who was standing a couple feet back, listening, not inserting himself, just present. Why? One of the young women said. Sin looked at her. Because he decided who belonged where before he ever talked to you. Silence. Then the second young woman said, quietly, I wondered. I thought maybe I'd misunderstood something. You didn't misunderstand anything, Madison told her. And in about 10 minutes, a representative from the hotel management is going to come through here and ask if you'd be willing to describe your experience tonight. I want you to know that you have every right to say exactly what happened. You don't have to soften it. You don't have to make it more comfortable for anyone. You just have to tell the truth. The young man looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jackson, then back at Madison. Who are you? He asked. My name's Madison Walker. She held out her hand. My dad runs a community foundation. He's been fighting this kind of thing for 20 years. The young man shook her hand. Marcus, he said. Marcus, she nodded. Them, what happened? All of it. The thing about what came next, the conversations, the statements, formal interviews that Marcia's HR coordinator conducted in a small conference room off the east corridor before the gala ended. That night was that none of it was dramatic in the expected way. He shouted. Nobody cried publicly. Nobody confronted Coleman in a hallway or made a scene in the ballroom. But instead was methodical and quiet and absolutely relentless. Volunteers from community partner organizations gave statements, separate accounts of the same pattern. A man in a charcoal suit, confident in his authority, redirecting them from their assigned positions with the easy certainty of someone who'd done it many times before and expected no resistance. The language varied. A mix-up, a call, thus suited for your group setup. The underlying message was consistent. Sist. You don't quite belong where they put you. The coordinator who'd originally assigned them confirmed each of their placements. Work confirmed it further. There was no ambiguity in the documentation, only in the story Coleman had told each of them. Sat in the conference room for 2 hours, not as a complainant she'd given her statement early, but because she'd made herself available in case any of the volunteers needed someone to talk to before or after they spoke to the HR coordinator. Them took her up on it. Marcus was the last. He sat down across from her after his interview was done and was quiet for a moment. Does this actually do anything? He asked. Or is this the part where they take statements, put them in a file, and nothing changes? Looked at him. She understood the question. She'd asked a version of it herself to her father. After the first time she'd watched someone be held accountable for something and then watched the accountability dissolve into paperwork and time. She said, I can't promise you a specific outcome, nodded, like he'd expected that. What I can tell you, she continued, is that 7 people told the truth tonight about something real that happened to them. And that's not nothing, even if it feels like it right now. One, because the thing about the truth is that it accumulates. The person says it, it's a complaint. 7 people say it, it's a pattern. The pattern is harder to dismiss. He was quiet for a moment, he said. The Hells Angels thing is that he stopped, clearly recalibrating the question. That's real? That's real. And people just, he paused. Is your family the same way? My whole life, Madison said simply. Absorbed this. Something in his posture shifted, a quality of tension he'd been carrying since she'd first seen him in the East Corridor, loosening by degrees. I grew up thinking, listen, he said slowly, I just did everything. Write the paperwork, the applications, the showing up early, the yes sir, ma'am. No ma'am, it would eventually not matter where I came from. Nodded. And then someone like Coleman comes along and shows you the rule still applies. Yeah, my dad used to say something about that, she said. He said the goal isn't to do everything right so that the rule disappears. The goal is to do everything right so that when the rule shows up, nobody can pretend it's your fault. Just looked at her. It's not a perfect answer, she admitted. The thing stopped hurting. Gun stop hurting, but it changes what the thing means. Quiet for a moment longer. Then that's actually a really good answer. He's a really good thinker, she said. People don't usually expect that. They see the vest and they make up their mind. Yeah, a small, rueful sound. You kind of did that too for a second. Most people do, she said. Kind of. The whole point of tonight, thing. They sat there for a moment with them. The two of them, small conference room off the East Corridor of a hotel that hosted charity galas for people with money. While 7 statements about a man in a charcoal suit sat in a growing file on an HR coordinator's laptop. Side, the gala was winding down. The string quartet had packed up, were collecting their coats and their validation tickets and their assurances that their checks had been received. When the ballroom was being reset, the invisible infrastructure of the evening was handling the final act of the machinery, quietly and efficiently and largely unnoticed. Richard Coleman had spent the last hour visible in the ballroom. Still professionally composed, still performing the role of regional manager. Madison had walked once and watched how the space around him had changed, the slight physical recalibration of people who were aware that something had shifted without quite knowing the details. He was avoiding him dramatically, but nobody was gravitating toward him either. He stood in a small island of professional courtesy and performed contentment, and Madison could see the calculation in it, the careful maintenance of an appearance. She found her father near the main doors. He was talking to Gerald Marsh and a woman Madison didn't know, compact 50s, wearing a blazer and carrying a legal pad. Marsh caught Madison's eye. Marsh caught Madison's eye and said something to the woman, who turned and looked at Madison with an expression of focused attention. Linda Park, Marsh said when Madison reached them, head of human resources. The statements from tonight, Madison said to Linda directly, happens with them. Linda looked at her steadily. Still, she had the particular composure of someone who'd handled many difficult situations and had learned that directness was usually more merciful than cushioning. Pending the full review, Mr. Coleman will be placed on administrative leave while we conduct some full investigation into tonight's events and any prior complaints that may be on file. Prior complaints? Linda paused, a careful pause. I'm not able to discuss specific personnel matters. The investigation will look at the full history. It will be comprehensive, Linda said. And the volunteers who gave statements tonight will be kept informed of the process and any relevant outcomes. Linda looked at her steadily, very thorough in organizing them. Tonight. Miss, that made our job significantly easier. Madison glanced at her father, watching her with an expression she'd seen before. Pride. The kind that didn't need to announce itself. The kind that was just there, solid and warm. A thing she could feel without having it performed for her. It needed to, Madison said. Marsh spoke then. I want to say something to both of you. He looked from Madison to Jackson. Tonight, what was said to your daughter is not the standard of this hotel or this event. We want you to know that. With respect, Jackson said, it has been the standard here long enough that 7 people had the same experience in one night. He said it without heat. Just fact. The standard is what actually happens. You intend. Marsh held his gaze. To his credit, he didn't flinch from it. He said, and that's going to change. So, Jackson said, I genuinely hope so. Because this event does important work, and the people those community organizations serve deserve to be in the room. He glanced at Madison. Not just the East Wing. The gala ended at 11:15. Madison and Jackson walked out together through the main doors, down the hotel steps, into the cool Phoenix night. Madison had her notebook in her hand, written down names, times, videos, key phrases from conversations throughout the evening. Habit is her father's lesson, the small act of making things real by putting them on paper, down at the first thing she'd written when she arrived. 40 minutes before any of it started, AZ Children's Healthcare Foundation Gala, Table 7E, Paula, task, guest services, main registration. Then she looked at the last thing she'd written, 7 statements. Confirmed, Linda Park, HR, administrative leave pending. It will change. She closed the notebook. Dad, did you know Gerald Marsh before tonight? And was quiet for a moment. I've worked with the hotel on 3 community partnership agreements over the last 5 years, he said. Signed off on every one of them. We've had dinner twice. He paused. Told you, because I didn't want you to feel like you needed a safety net going into events. I wanted you to learn to stand on your own. Madison processed this. You knew. I knew I wasn't walking in there entirely alone, he said. But I also knew you weren't either. You were standing on your own before I got there, when I just followed your lead. She turned to look at him, watching her with that same quiet expression, open, warm, steady. Coleman didn't know who you were, she said, who you actually were. When he said what he said to me, he had no idea. Most people don't, Jackson said. It's usually when it happens. When they're sure they already know. Then Madison thought about Marcus in the conference room. 7 statements in Linda Park's laptop. The young woman who'd said quietly, I wondered, but I thought maybe I'd misunderstood something. She thought about all the rooms where people had made themselves smaller because it cost less than fighting the calculus that told them they didn't belong. And she thought about her father standing at a bar, in a hotel he'd helped support, in a vest that half the room had already judged before he said a word, asking a man to explain himself, in a voice so even and grounded and utterly without malice that the man had had no weapon against it. Because that was the thing about Jackson Walker that nobody who judged him by appearance ever got to understand. He wasn't fearless. He wasn't invulnerable. He'd been in rooms that wanted him gone more times than he could count, and it had cost him. Genuinely cost him. As Madison was only now beginning to fully see. He learned that the most powerful thing he had wasn't his reputation or his connections, or even the network of people who'd stand beside him if things went wrong. The most powerful thing he had was his consistency. The unchanging quality of who he was, regardless of the room, regardless of who was watching, regardless of what they believed about him before he arrived. If Dithaban couldn't argue with consistent character over time, he couldn't dismiss it, couldn't reassign it to the East Wing, couldn't tell it didn't belong. Eventually be forced to see it for what it was. Madison looked at her father in the cool night air outside the Phoenix Grand Hotel. Thank you for coming in, she said. Wouldn't have missed it, he said. They walked toward the parking lot together, and behind them, in a conference room off the East Corridor, 7 accounts of one man's consistent choices sat waiting in a file that was just beginning to grow. The file didn't stay small for long. Arrived at her office. At 7:45, the following morning, Anne found 3 additional emails, waiting 2 from volunteers who hadn't given statements the night before, but had seen the HR coordinator's contact information shared in a chat among the partner organizations, and one from a woman named Carla Reyes, who identified herself as a former Phoenix Grand employee and said she had information she'd been holding for 2 years and wasn't sure who to give it to until now. read all three emails before she took off her coat. Then she called Gerald Marsh. He picked up on the second ring. "It's not a one-night incident," Linda said. "It's what I'm telling you at 7:45 in the morning, before I've even made coffee. When can you come up? Give me an hour." Richard Coleman had also been awake since before 7. He lived 40 minutes from the hotel in a suburb where the houses had three-car garages and well-maintained lawns, and the kind of quiet that felt like accomplishment. Driven home after the gala, in complete silence, and not turning on the radio, not making any calls, running the evening's events through his mind, in the particular way of a man who was still convinced the fundamental problem was one of optics rather than substance. He'd made errors. He could see that now. He'd moved too quickly on the Walker girl, been too visible about it, and the arrival of her father with his connection to Marsh, entirely unexpected connection, had turned a routine enforcement of social standards into something with witnesses and documentation and a formal HR process. The error, the miscalculation. He should have been more discreet, patient. Then he had not at any point during the drive home or the sleepless hours that followed about Madison Walker standing at the registration table with her invitation and her notebook and her confirmation from Paula, and considered what it had felt like to be told she didn't belong there. He thought about everything else. His 11 years at the property, performance reviews, uniformly excellent. His relationships with senior management, strong and collegial. Partnership agreements with Jackson Walker's foundation. And how had he missed that? How had that detail somehow never crossed his desk in a recognizable way? He thought about lawyers, about precedent, about the difference between a formal complaint and an investigation, a stint and a termination. He had not thought about Madison. That absence, that particular gap in his accounting, was the thing Jackson Walker had already identified and would spend the next several weeks watching the investigation slowly confirm. By 9 o'clock, the formal investigation was underway. Linda had presented Marsh with a preliminary summary. Statements from the previous evening. From Carla Reyes' email. The 2 additional volunteer contacts and the results of a quick review she'd run that morning of incident logs and event records going back 14 months. What she found in those records was subtle, the kind of thing that was easy to miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. Patterns in volunteer assigns. Consistent clustering of community organization personnel in peripheral event areas. Original notes in event logs about placement adjustments made by Coleman personally. Language was always administrative. The pattern underneath it was not. Careful, Linda said, sitting across from Marsh with the preliminary summary on the table between them. Wrote anything down that was explicitly discriminatory. Reassignment has a stated operational reason. When you look at who was being reassigned, she slid a page across the table. Consistent. Community partner volunteers, scholarship recipients, people from lower income programs. Anyone he'd categorized, apparently, as not meeting his standard for the main event space. Marsh studied the page. His expression was the expression of a man processing genuine surprise alongside the uncomfortable awareness that he should have looked more carefully sooner. At least 3 years based on what I can verify. Possibly longer. Carla Reyes was an event coordinator who left the property 2 years ago. The email says she raised concerns about Coleman's behavior towards certain volunteers internally before she resigned. Linda paused. There's no record of that concern being formally documented. Quiet. Someone received it and chose not to process it, Linda said carefully. I know yet who, and I don't know why. That's part of what the investigation needs to determine. When Marsh set the page down, this is bigger than one night. It's bigger. Yes. I don't know yet, Linda said. Jackson Walker already suspected that. When he said last night that he didn't think it was the first time, she paused. He was right. And I think he knew he was right. Marsh leaned back. Did he know? Linda looked at him. Because he's been the person who gets reassigned his whole life, she said. Recognized the pattern. Because he's lived inside it. Silence that followed. That sentence was a specific kind of silence, the kind that happens when something simple and obvious lands in a room full of complicated things and makes all of them look different. Marsh nodded slowly. Set up a call with Jackson Walker. Afternoon, if he's available. Already emailed his foundation office this morning, Linda said. Jackson got the email at 11:43 while he was in his shop, elbow deep in a transmission rebuild. He read it on his phone with grease on his hands, read it twice, then set the phone on the workbench and kept working for another 20 minutes before he responded. Not because he was dismissing it, because he wanted to think clearly before he replied, and he thought more clearly when his hands were occupied. He told Madison over lunch, sitting at the kitchen table, in the house, where she'd grown up, the same table, where she'd done homework at 9 years, and saw old and heard her father on the phone talking to attorneys about a zoning dispute and heard him talk people through problems she only half understood. The same table where she'd watched him operate with a patient, methodical persistence that looked nothing like the version of Hell's Angels that television had taught people to expect. Investigating, he said. Linda Park called me too, Madison said. This morning. Jackson looked at her. What did she say? They'd found documentation consistent with a pattern. The investigation was going to be comprehensive. Did tell. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak with someone from their legal team. Madison turned her coffee cup in her hands. Said yes. Good. She also said. Madison paused. She said, Carla Reyes reached out. The woman who emailed last night. She tried to raise concerns about Coleman 2 years ago, and it didn't get documented properly. Madison's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it settled a specific quality of unsurprise. The face of a man hearing the confirmation of something he'd already understood to be probable, and buried it or ignored it. Same result, he said. He sat with it for a moment. Dad, Madison said, if someone in hotel management knew and didn't act on it, then Coleman didn't build this by himself, Jackson said. To build it because people who could have stopped it chose not to. He paused. It's usually how these things work. It's almost never one person acting alone in a vacuum. There's always a structure that allowed it. People who looked the other way. Procedures that were technically followed but applied selectively. Thought about that. Madison said, about the event records, Linda had mentioned the language that was always administrative, the pattern underneath that was not. About the careful, considered architecture of 11 years of plausible deniability. Smart about it, she said. Most people who do this for a long time are, Jackson said. They're gone. They learn to operate inside the legitimate language of their position. That's why it takes a pattern to prove it. One incident is a misunderstanding, is a method. Madison's phone buzzed. She looked at it and her expression shifted. What? Jackson asked. She turned the phone around. The text from Marcus, the young volunteer from the previous night, said, my community center director talked to your dad. The other centers say their volunteers had the same experience at previous hotel events, not just last night. Going back at least 2 years. Jackson read it. He read it again. Then he set the phone down on the table between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because this was the point at which the shape of the thing changed. Statements from one night was a serious incident. Statements from one night, plus a former employee's documented complaint, plus event records showing a 3-year pattern, plus now 3 additional community organizations reporting consistent experiences. Across multiple events, that was something different. The system. So, he again, a deliberate, sustained, institutionalized system of discrimination disguised as operational protocol, administered by a man in a charcoal suit who had learned exactly how much he could do without anyone who mattered ever looked closely enough to see it. Madison said, not quite a question, more like thinking out loud. If it goes back 2 years across 3 organizations, Jackson said, we're talking about dozens of volunteers. More. He paused. Dozens of people who arrived at events they'd been invited to. Been told there was a mix-up, been redirected to the East Wing, and walked away wondering quietly if they'd done something wrong. felt the weight of that number. She thought about the young woman from the previous night who'd said, "I wondered, but I thought maybe I'd misunderstood something." She thought about that sentence as a single data point, and she multiplied it, applied it to every volunteer at every event over 2 years. Quiet recalibration, every small erosion of confidence. Person who'd gone home and wondered about themselves instead of about the man in the charcoal suit. "Respond to Marcus," she said. "Tell him to give me his director's number," Jackson said. "I want to talk to them directly." Madison texted Marcus back. Response came in under a minute, a phone number, and the name of the director. Dialed immediately right there at the kitchen table while Madison listened and turned her coffee cup in her hands. The conversation lasted 37 minutes. Madison spoke with the director of Marcus's community center, a woman named Phyllis, who had been running programs in South Phoenix for 19 years and who had, without own detailed notes from 2 separate events at the Phoenix Grand where her volunteers had been redirected. She'd submitted a formal complaint to the hotel through their event feedback form 18 months ago. He received a response. "Never," Jackson said. "Not a single word," Phyllis said. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Then, do you still have a copy of that feedback submission?" "I keep records of everything," Phyllis said. "When you've been doing this work as long as I have, you learn that documentation is the only thing that survives. I'd like to share your records with the hotel's HR department and, depending on how this develops, potentially with a legal representative. Would that be all right with you?" "More than all right," Phyllis said, waiting 18 months for someone to ask. He hung up. Jackson sat at the kitchen table for a moment without speaking and watched him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Gerald Marsh is a good man who's been running a system that had a bad person in it for a long time. And part of the reason that bad person lasted so long is that the good man wasn't looking closely enough." He paused. "And I'm thinking about how to tell him that in a way that he can actually hear. Because if he gets defensive, then the investigation becomes about protecting the hotel instead of fixing the problem." Jackson nodded. In those conversations before, the moment an institution feels attacked, it stops trying to understand and starts trying to survive. He looked at Madison. "When the goal isn't to destroy the Phoenix Grand, the goal is to make sure it actually changes. And that's a different conversation." Madison thought about this, about the distinction between punishment and accountability, about the way her father moved through these situations, always angled toward change rather than toward retribution, always looking at the structure rather than just the person. It made some people mistake him for soft. It made people who understood what he was doing recognize him as one of the most effective people in any room. The call with Marsh happened at 2 o'clock. Jackson sat at his desk in the small office off the shop, while Madison sat in the corner of the room, a legal pad on her knee, taking notes the way she always did. Marsh opened with an apology. Formal, genuine, without the careful hedging that legal liability usually inserted into corporate apologies. Then he said, "I think we may be looking at something considerably larger than what happened Wednesday night." "You are," Jackson said. A pause. "Linda walked me through the preliminary findings this morning, and Phyllis Carpenter from the South Phoenix Community Center has records of a complaint submitted 18 months ago that received no response. She's not the only one. Silence on the line. A different quality of silence, the kind where a person is processing information that is worse than they expected and trying to stay functional while they do it." "Who else?" Marsh said. "We're still making calls," Jackson said. "I want to tell you something, Gerald, before this goes further. I think you're the kind of man who needs to hear it straight rather than have it parcel it out in legal language." He paused. "Coleman wasn't a rogue operation. He built it inside your systems, your event protocols, your feedback channels, your operational language. Complaints went into your feedback forms and disappeared. It didn't happen by accident. Either your processes failed systematically or someone inside those processes was aware and didn't act." Pause. "Longer I know," Marsh said. "It came out quietly. Linda told me this morning about Carla Reyes. about the concerns she raised before she left. He paused again, trying to figure out how that didn't reach me. Right questions, said. That's the right question, Jackson said. And when you find the answer, I think you'll find the rest of it. Peace. What Jackson was describing and what Marsh was beginning to understand was that Richard Coleman's behavior had been possible, not because of a single failure, but because of an accumulation of small ones. The event coordinator who'd received Phyllis Carpenter's feedback form and decided it wasn't specific enough to escalate. The manager who'd signed off on Carla Reyes's exit paperwork and noted her concerns as general cultural fit without specifics. Where Coleman's reassignment notes were always just vague enough, just bureaucratic enough to slide past routine review. Coleman hadn't hidden his pattern. He'd just written it in a language that institutions were already primed to accept. Jackson had seen that language before, had spent years learning to name it. You need from me? Marsh asked. Transparency, Jackson said. Access for your HR investigation to every event record going back 3 years. Independent review of the complaint handling process, not internal, external. Outreach to every community partner organization that has worked with your hotel in that period, with a genuine invitation to report their experience. He paused. And I want the volunteers who gave statements on Wednesday night to receive a formal acknowledgement from hotel leadership. Form letter, something real. Done, Marsh said. All of it. And when the investigation concludes, Jackson said, I want to be part of the conversation about what structural changes are implemented. Because I need credit. Because I want to make sure the changes address the actual problem and not just the visible version of it. Expect nothing less from you, Marsh said. After the call ended, Madison looked at her father. He said, we on that call, we're still making calls. Because we are, he said simply. I'm 19. I know how old you are. He looked at her steadily. So know what you did. Wednesday night, we organized 7 people to give statements in 2 hours in a hotel ballroom, everyone in the middle of a charity gala, everyone, while still shaking from a confrontation that would have sent most adults home for the night. He paused. You don't have to be any particular age to be part of this. Madison felt something settle in her chest. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride, something more fundamental. A sense of place, of purpose, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Carpenter wants to meet, she said, looking at her notes. Person. She said she has boxes of records from multiple events. Then we go meet Phyllis Carpenter. They went the next afternoon. Operated out of a converted storefront in South Phoenix. And when they walked in, she was already at conference table with 2 boxes of files and a handwritten timeline that went back 27 months. She was compact and direct and had the particular energy of someone who had been right about something for a long time and was finally being asked to explain it to people who could do something with it. Submitted that feedback form in February of last year. She said before they'd even fully sat down. Wrote it carefully. Indicated the names of volunteers who were redirected. In the Times, the names of the people who redirected them. The fact that their original assignments were confirmed by the event coordinator. Specific and professional, and I kept a copy. She slid a printed page across the table, and I never heard anything back. Not an acknowledgement, not a form response, nothing. And looked at the document. It was thorough, clear. The kind of formal complaint that anyone reading it in good faith would have had to take seriously. Do you know what happened to it? Phyllis asked. We're still finding out, Jackson said. Linda Park at the Phoenix Grand has it now, and she's looking into why it wasn't processed. Phyllis looked at him, then at Madison, then back at Jackson. Your daughter was the one who organized the volunteers Wednesday night? She was. Phyllis looked at Madison with an expression that was sharp and warm at the same time. How old are you? 19, Madison said. Phyllis made a sound that wasn't quite laughter but carried the same warmth. Doing this at 22. And it took me 3 years to get as organized as you apparently got in 2 hours. She said it matter-of-factly, as though it were a data point she was filing away. We need organized. They spent 2 hours with Phyllis, going through the timeline she'd constructed. identifying the additional organizations she'd spoken with informally about similar experiences. By the time they left, Madison had filled 12 pages of her legal pad. The file that had started with 7 statements in a hotel conference room had grown into something that now had a shape, a name, and a trajectory. Not just an incident, one documented. Across multiple organizations, Denton. Multiple event years, multiple, with a paper trail that led not only to Richard Coleman, but to the processes that had protected him. The investigation was no longer contained to a single night at a charity gala. It was now about what had been allowed to persist quietly and systematically in the space between what an institution said it believed and what it actually did. Coleman, at home in his suburb with his 3-car garage, was still calculating optics. He didn't yet know that the thing he'd built so carefully over 11 years had already been fully named by a 19-year-old girl with a notebook and her father in a leather vest, and that the documentation supporting that name was sitting in 2 boxes in a converted storefront in South Phoenix. He didn't know that 7 statements had become dozens. He didn't know that Phyllis Carpenter had been waiting 27 months for someone to call. That the feedback form he'd assumed, and he didn't know that institutional silence had vanished into the institutional silence, where inconvenient things went the form that named his behavior clearly and professionally, and in specific documented detail had been printed, kept, and was now sitting on Linda Park's desk with a yellow legal pad note clipped to the front of it. The note, in Jackson Walker's handwriting, said it was submitted 18 months ago. Find out why it stopped. Linda Park was already looking. Linda Park found the answer on a Friday afternoon, 9 days after the gala. She'd been working through the hotel's internal communications archive, a process that was tedious and methodical, and exactly the kind of work that revealed things people assumed would stay buried when she found it. Email chain. February of the previous year. Phyllis Carpenter's feedback form had arrived in the general event feedback inbox, been read by an events administrator named Kevin Delgado, and flagged for escalation. Had written a brief internal note. Concerns volunteer placement at January. Gala. Possible discrimination issue. Recommend review by senior management. Email had been forwarded once to Richard Coleman. When it replied 4 words, handled. No further action. Delgado had apparently accepted that and moved on. The form had been filed. The chain had closed, and Phyllis Carpenter had waited 18 months in complete silence. Linda sat at her desk and read that 4-word reply 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and called Gerald Marsh. Where it stopped, she said. Marsh was quiet for a moment after she explained. Then he forwarded the complaint about himself to himself. Positively, yes. Linda kept her voice level. Kevin Delgado escalated it to the senior manager most directly implicated. Process failure. Coleman receiving it and closing it with 4 words is the substantive failure. She paused. It's what I need you to understand, Gerald. Delgado is 26 years old and had been in that administrator role for 4 months. He followed the escalation protocol correctly. Senior manager review. No way of knowing the senior manager reviewing. It was the subject of the complaint, because the protocol doesn't disclosure of the subject, Marsh said. Another silence. Longer. So Coleman designed his behavior knowing the complaint process would route through him, Marsh said. You can't prove he designed it, Linda said. What I can prove is that he benefited from the gap. Either that was deliberate or opportunistic, the outcome is the same. She paused. We've also found 2 other feedback submissions in the last 3 years that were escalated to Coleman and closed without documentation of any corrective action. Similar concerns. Marsh exhaled slowly. It's the sound of a man who had built something over decades and was now understanding that something had been wrong inside it for longer than he'd known. When can you have the full investigation report ready? End of next week, Linda said. But I want to brief Jackson Walker before I finalize it. Ben, a central part of building the evidentiary base to see the findings before they become official. Marsh said, set it up. She called Jackson that evening. At the shop again. She'd noticed he was almost always at the shop When she called in the evening, he went. And she'd started to understand that this was where he thought, where he processed things. And he let his hands work while his mind moved through problems. We found the gap in the complaint process, she said. She told him. All of it. The email chain. Delgado's 4-month tenure. Coleman's 4-word reply. One. The 2 additional submissions that had been similarly closed. Was quiet through all of it. When she finished, he said, Kevin Delgado. Is he still at the hotel? Yes, he did the right thing, Jackson said. He didn't. He flagged it. He just didn't know the system would route it to the wrong person. It's my assessment as well. Make sure that's documented, Jackson said. Want him to be collateral damage in a cleanup that's aimed at the wrong target. Linda paused. She made a note. Already in the draft, she said. Appreciate you saying it. He's 26, and he tried, Jackson said. It matters. She told Madison about the call afterward. Madison was sitting at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table, always the same table with her laptop open and her legal pad beside it, building what had evolved over 9 days from a list of contacts into something closer to a comprehensive record of the pattern's full scope. Coleman routed the complaint to himself, Madison said, and then closed it. Yes. Matt stared at her laptop screen for a moment. Just biased, she said. He was actively protecting himself. 2 different things. They are, Jackson agreed. Because a person who's biased and careless is a problem you can correct with training and oversight. She turned to look at her father, a person who's biased and deliberately manipulates the oversight system to protect himself is something different. That's calculated. That requires a different kind of response. Looked at his daughter with the expression he wore when she said something that landed further than it expected. Not surprise, exactly, but a particular quality of recognition, like watching someone step into a space they'd been growing toward for years and finally reach it. Yes, he said. It does. So what's the right response? Ethan swallowed. That's the question. And I don't think there's one clean answer. Coleman, what happens to him specifically? The system, what gets changed? So this can't happen the same way again. There are 2 separate conversations, and they have to stay separate, because if you collapse them into each other, you end up addressing one and neglecting the other. Wrote something on her legal pad. What are you writing? He asked. Notes for the meeting with Linda next week. She looked up. I want to be prepared. I don't want to walk in there and just react to what they want to know what I think before I get there. Jackson nodded. I learned it from watching you. The investigation report was completed on Thursday. Presented it in a conference room at the Phoenix Grand Marsh. Linda, the external legal consultant, Jackson, and Madison. Copies had been distributed 24 hours in advance, so everyone arrived having read it. The report was 41 pages. It documented Coleman's systematic redirection of community partner volunteers across 19 events spanning 3 years. He documented 3 complaint submissions that had been routed to Coleman and closed without corrective action. Documented the gap in the escalation protocol that had made this possible. It documented the broader organizational failure, the absence of independent complaint review, the insufficient separation between the subject of a complaint and the review process for that complaint. It also documented its section in a separate impact, tab reviews with 14 volunteers and 3 community organization directors who described the cumulative effect of consistent redirection, the quiet erosion of confidence, the internalized doubt. Internalized the decision by some organizations to stop sending volunteers to the hotel's events entirely rather than continue exposing their people to an experience that made them feel unwelcome. That last section was the one that hit hardest. Not the 11 years, not the administrative language, not even the 4-word email. The community center director from West Phoenix, who'd said in her interview, we stopped applying. The 3rd time, our volunteers were moved. We just stopped. We told them the hotel wasn't a good fit. We didn't explain why. Quietly removed it from our list of partnership opportunities. When read that section aloud in the conference room, the room was completely silent. Marsh said, how many organizations Linda looked at her notes. We've identified 4 that significantly reduced or eliminated their participation in hotel events over the past 2.5 years. Them cited scheduling conflicts in their official communications. The reason, based on interviews, was what they experienced here. Marsh closed his copy of the report. I want to personally contact each of those organizations. Is it appropriate? Jackson said. Coleman's legal representative had requested a copy of the report that morning. The request had been formally noted and would be addressed through the appropriate channels. Coleman himself had not been in the building since his administrative leave began 9 days earlier. Linda had spoken with him twice by phone, brief and procedural exchanges in which he'd been careful and correct, and had offered nothing beyond what was directly asked. He was still calculating, still managing exposure. Anyone still, from what anyone could tell, operating in the same framework of professional self-preservation that had characterized his approach since the night of the gala. When Jackson had not spoken to him, he had not tried to. Madison had thought about it once, calling Coleman, asking to meet, having a direct conversation outside the formal process. She turned the idea over for 2 days before she let it go. She was afraid of the conversation. Not because she was afraid of the conversation, because she understood, the way her father had taught her to understand, that some conversations couldn't happen until a person was ready to actually have them. And Coleman wasn't there yet. He might not get there for a long time. He might never get there. Forcing the conversation prematurely wouldn't produce honesty, produce performance. And she wasn't interested in performance. The meeting at the hotel ran 3 hours. They worked through the report, section by section findings, recommendations, proposed structural changes. The external legal consultant was there primarily to ensure the conversation stayed grounded in what was actionable. And Madison sat beside her father and took notes and spoke when she had something specific to say, which turned out to be more often than she'd anticipated. Point. The gossipy one. Discussing the proposed revision of the complaint escalation protocol, she said, in the new process, needs to include an external reporting option, not just internal HR. If someone from a partner organization has a concern, they should be able to submit it to an independent third party that has no operational connection to the hotel. You're still relying on people trusting an internal system that just failed them. He looked at her. That's in the recommendations, she said. 37. I know, Madison said. I want to make sure it's treated as non-negotiable and not something that gets value engineered out in implementation. Marsh looked at her. Something in his expression was both tired and deeply attentive. Non-negotiable, he said. Good. Jackson said nothing. The second major twist of the meeting came from a direction none of them had anticipated. The external legal consultant, a woman named Sandra Coe, who had been largely quiet through the first 2 hours, listening and taking her own notes, looked up from the report at the start of the 3rd hour and said, flag something that's outside the formal scope of the investigation, but that I think warrants discussion. One looked at her. Feedback forms that were submitted and suppressed, Phyllis Carpenter's, specifically, one to me. But also the 2 others, Linda identified those are documented complaints about discriminatory treatment that were received, acknowledged. Internally, one, and then deliberately prevented from reaching anyone with the authority to act on them. Sandra paused. That's not just an organizational failure. Depending on jurisdiction and the specific facts, that could constitute intentional interference with a formal complaint process, which is a different legal category than the underlying discrimination itself. Was very still. Marsh said, are you saying Coleman's liability may extend beyond the internal investigation? Saying it's a question that should be asked, Sandra said. Someone was standing to ask it, which is not this hotel. She looked at Jackson. Potentially the organizations and individuals whose complaints were suppressed. And held Sandra's gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Madison. Madison was writing. Her pen was moving across the legal pad in the particular focus ways moved when she was capturing something she needed to hold on to precisely. Finished writing. Looked up. Phyllis Carpenter has kept records of everything for 27 months, she said. She should be in this conversation. Sandra nodded. And Marcus's community center director. Madison looked at her notes, and the two organizations that stopped submitting feedback entirely after their complaints disappeared. She looked at the room. You should all know that what happened to their submissions wasn't just negligence. That someone actively closed it. The weight of that settled over the conference room like something physical, like a change in barometric pressure, the kind you feel before a storm arrives. It said, we'll support their access to independent legal counsel. More than that, Jackson said. His voice was still. Even still, completely without aggression. But there was something beneath it. Now, a quality of arrival, of reaching the place in a long conversation, where the fundamental point finally gets stated directly. Transparent with them about everything this investigation found, including the email chain, including Coleman's forward response, every suppressed submission. He paused, deserved to know exactly what happened to the words they wrote. Put effort into those complaints. They trusted a process, deserved to know where their trust went. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. You're right. He said it simply, without qualification or institutional hedging. Tell them everything. After the meeting, Jackson and Madison drove back toward home in the truck he'd been driving for 8 years. One, with the cracked dashboard that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 of those 8 years, and kept not fixing because it still drove fine. And there was always something else to address. And had the legal pad on her knee. She looked at her notes for a while without speaking. She said, Sandra Coe. She said it might be intentional interference with a complaint process. Is that a criminal thing? Potentially, Jackson said. Depends on the facts, the jurisdiction, whether anyone decides to pursue it. He paused. That's not our call to make. That belongs to Phyllis and Marcus's director and the others. You knew it was a possibility, Madison said, before Sandra said it. Jackson glanced at him. I'd thought about it. Didn't you raise it? Because it needed to come from outside the room, he said. He raised it. Coleman's people would have framed the whole investigation as Jackson Walker using a personal incident as leverage to build a legal case against a hotel manager, letting the hotel's own external legal counsel identify it independently. He paused. It becomes what it actually is. A legal question arising from the facts. Madison to look at him. You think about this stuff constantly, don't you? It wasn't quite a question. He heard the texture of it. He said, simply, I do. You've been thinking 3 moves ahead this whole time. Enough of these situations to know that what you say, and when you say it, and who's in the room, when you say it all matter. He said, it's not manipulation. It's just understanding that the truth needs the right conditions to land. Madison thought about that for a while. The truck moved through Phoenix in the late afternoon, through neighborhoods that transitioned from corporate to residential, to the quieter streets that led to the part of the city where she'd grown up. The garage sat behind the house, where her father had spent 20 years being the person everybody had already made up their mind about before he walked through the door. Get tired of it, she said. Of what? About all of it. The conditions, timing. The being in a room and knowing that half the people there have already decided what you are before you've said anything. She paused, always having to be smarter about it than the person who's wrong. Drove for a moment. Then he said, sometimes. Yeah, it was the most unguarded answer she could remember him giving to that kind of question. The lesson, not the framework, just the honest thing. One. But then something happens. He continued last Thursday when I talked to Phyllis Carpenter for the first time, and she said, been waiting 27 months for someone to call. And I think, okay, someone has to make the call. Might as well be the person who understands the call needs to be made. Madison was quiet. You'll get tired of it too, he said. Some days. The tiredness is real and you should let yourself feel it. You don't think you're going to stop. No, she said. You don't think I am either. The rest of the way, in a silence that was full rather than empty, The kind of silence that tall people share when they've been through something together and don't need to keep describing it to each other because they were both there. Park sent the formal notification letters to Phyllis Carpenter and the other affected organizations the following Monday. Each letter was 3 pages and included the key findings of the investigation, the specific documentation of their suppressed complaints, and an offer of the hotel's full cooperation with any independent process the organizations chose to pursue. Carpenter called Madison when she received hers. Twice, Phyllis said. All of it, every word. A pause. It's my complaint in 4 words. I know. I spent a week writing that form, Phyllis said. I wanted to get it exactly right. I wrote drafts. I had my assistant review it. I made sure every specific detail was included because I knew that if I was vague, it wouldn't be taken seriously. Her voice was controlled. But Madison could hear what was underneath it, the specific, layered anger of someone who had done everything correctly and then watched it mean nothing. And he closed it in 4 words. He did, Madison said. Everyone knows that. A silence. What do you think I should do? Phyllis asked. Madison thought of her father's voice saying, that belongs to Phyllis and the others. He thought of the conversation about whose call it was to make. I think you should talk to a lawyer, Madison said. An independent one. Not anyone connected to the hotel. Someone in mind, Phyllis said. Good. And I think, Phyllis continued, that when this is over, whatever over ends up looking like I want to be part of whatever comes next, the other organizations. For the volunteers who went home, wondering if they'd done something wrong. A pause. I want this to just be a report that sits in a file. It won't be, Madison said. How can you be sure? Madison looked at her legal pad. 12 pages of notes that had started with 7 names in a hotel conference room and had grown into something she hadn't fully named yet, but could feel taking shape, a structure, a purpose, something with function beyond the immediate. Because we're not done, she said. This is the part where the documentation is finished. But what gets built from it that's still happening? Was quiet for a moment. Then, your father raised you right, Madison said. But he'd say I did most of this part myself, Phyllis said. Richard Coleman received his formal termination notice on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the gala. It came by certified mail to the house in the suburb with the 3-car garage. Precise and comprehensive, and cited the specific findings of the investigation, accompanied by a separate legal communication from Andreco's firm on behalf of the hotel regarding potential civil liability connected to the suppression of formal complaint submissions. Coleman sat with the letter in his kitchen for a long time. He was still trying to calculate the damage. He was still thinking about his 11 years, performance reviews, his collegial relationships, and went still his standing. But underneath all of that calculation, somewhere below the professional arithmetic, something was starting to shift. Something slow and unwelcome and unavoidable. The way certain realizations are not the kind that arrive with sudden clarity, but the kind that accumulate day after day. In the quiet of a house in the suburbs where the thing you thought protected you has been named and measured and found to be exactly what it was. He thought about Madison Walker standing at a registration table with her invitation in one hand and her notebook in the other. The first time since the night of the gala, he actually let himself think about her, about what she'd done to his position. Not about what her father's connection to Marsh had cost him. Not about the investigation or the report or the letter sitting on his kitchen table. About the look on her face when he'd said it. He'd noticed it at the time and immediately moved past it. Filed it under the category of things he didn't need to process because the decision had already been made. But now sitting alone with a letter that represented the systematic accounting of 11 years of decisions, he couldn't move past it anymore. He'd been trying to do her job. She had arrived early, documentation in order. She had done everything correctly, he boasted. And he had decided before he knew a single specific thing about her that she didn't belong. The calculation Coleman had been running for the 6 weeks, the professional calculation, the exposure calculation, the damage control calculation didn't have a line item for that. no column for what it actually costs a 19-year-old to stand in a public room and be told, clearly and audibly, by a man with institutional authority, that she is not the kind of person who belongs there. He sat in his kitchen. He sat in his kitchen. He didn't have the language for what he was beginning to feel, because the language required a kind of honesty about himself that he hadn't practiced and wasn't sure he knew how to use. The feeling was there, uncomfortable and specific, and not going away. It would take him a long time to find words for it. Madison Walker, sitting at her kitchen table, 20 miles away, with her legal pad and her laptop, and the growing architecture of something new, would not be waiting for him to find them. She had already moved forward. The legal pad had been replaced by a laptop document that was now 47 pages long. Madison hadn't planned it that way. She hadn't sat down one morning and decided to write a 47-page document. It had accumulated the way important things accumulate, one conversation at a time, one phone call at a time, one name added to a growing list of people who had experienced the same specific erasure and had never had a structure to put around it until now. She'd started with 12 pages of notes from the meeting at Phyllis Carpenter's community center. Then she'd added the interview summaries, then the timeline, then the structural analysis she'd written at 2 a.m. after a conversation with her father that had lasted 3 hours and covered everything from complaint process design to the psychology of institutional complicity. She hadn't been sleeping much. Her father noticed. He noticed the way he always noticed things, not by watching for them, but by simply being present enough that details registered without effort. He came into the kitchen one morning and found her at the table at 6:15 with a cold cup of coffee and the laptop screen reflected in her eyes. And he made a fresh pot without commenting on the cold cup and set a mug beside her without saying anything about the time. He looked up. "I'm fine. I know," he said. And he sat down across from her with his own coffee and waited, because he'd learned years ago that Madison processed things outward when she was ready and not a moment before. When she closed the laptop, "I want to build something," she said. "Not just the complaint structure changes at the hotel, not just the legal process for Phyllis and the others." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "Something that exists separately from this specific incident. Something that other organizations can use when this happens to their volunteers. Because it's going to keep happening not just at the Phoenix Grand, not just in Phoenix, and right now the people it happens to have nowhere to go and no framework for understanding what hit them. Listen, I want to create a formal advocacy program through the foundation," she said, specifically for community volunteers and partner organizations who experience discriminatory treatment at institutional events. Resource Center, a complaint documentation system that's independent, legal referral access, and training not for the institutions, at least not primarily for the volunteers themselves. So they know their rights before they walk into a room. You know what to write down, and how to write it, and where to send it. She's been building this in her head for 3 weeks. Hear it in her voice, the particular clarity of someone who has thought something through, past the point of uncertainty into the territory of conviction. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Then, the foundation can support it structurally. We have the nonprofit infrastructure, I know." She paused. "We want it to be its own thing, with its own identity. Not just a program of your foundation, something that stands independently, that can grow beyond what we can house. It takes time, I know that too. And money and people. Legal structure." He paused. "And you're 19. Started building the foundation at 34, she said. And people told you then that you were too young and too associated with the wrong image, and that nobody would take it seriously." He looked at her. "I know the stories, Dad," she said quietly. "You told me. And the ones you didn't tell me, I figured out. A silence, the particular kind that happens between two people who know each other completely and are standing at a threshold together." He said, "Okay, what? Okay, let's build it." Moved the way that certain periods of life move at 2 speeds simultaneously. Feet each day stretching long and full while the weeks compressed into a blur of meetings and phone calls and documents and decisions. Madison was taking 2 community college courses online, and had told her instructors she might be slow on some deadlines. Both of them, after hearing a brief explanation, had told her that the deadlines were flexible. Phyllis Carpenter became a founding advisor at their first planning meeting. With a binder with a binder inches thick, tabs labeled by category, and an expression that said she had been preparing for this particular meeting for approximately 27 months. Then, she confirmed, when Madison said as much. I just didn't know who the meeting was going to be with yet. Came on as a volunteer coordinator. He was 20 years old and working part-time at his community center and had, no doubt, a precise and specific talent for logistics, for understanding how large groups of people needed to move through processes. Information had to be structured to be accessible, rather than overwhelming. How systems needed to be designed for the person who was scared and confused and had never done this before, rather than for the person who already knew how. Counts explain loss. When growing up with a grandmother who had navigated the immigration system, the healthcare system, when the housing assistance system simultaneously for 6 years while working 2 jobs. Learn how systems fail people. He said, when you watch someone you love get failed by them over and over. Wrote that down. She wrote a lot of things down. The 47-page document grew to 63, then 80. Then stopped being a single document and became a folder of documents: organizational structure, bylaws, draft, jam design, Zonos resource guides, ZASP1, training curriculum outline. Done it in the mornings and in the evenings and in the spaces between other things. Done it with the focused energy she worked on it that found the Fenji of someone who had found the specific intersection of what they were good at and what they cared about, which is a rare and powerful thing to find at 19 years old. Jackson watched his daughter build and stayed mostly in the background. He connected her with people she needed to know: an attorney who specialized in nonprofit law, a program director at an established Phoenix advocacy organization who agreed to meet for coffee and ended up staying for 3 hours, a former city council member who had spent 15 years navigating the specific architecture of institutional discrimination and had thoughts about nearly everything. He made introductions, provided resources, answered questions, and consistently declined to lead. It's yours. This is yours. When she asked him to come to a planning meeting and take the chair, when you have more experience. I have different experience, he said. And this isn't my program, it's yours. The moment I take the chair, and the room starts looking at me instead of you. And that's not the organization you're trying to build. With him about it for 20 minutes. He listened to every word and then repeated what he'd said without changing any of it, because he was right and they both knew it, and eventually she acknowledged it. Zon. She took the chair. The formal launch event was scheduled for a Saturday in early spring, months after the night of the gala, and had chosen an event space carefully, not a hotel ballroom, not a corporate venue, but the community center where Marcus worked, that could hold 150 people comfortably, and that felt like the kind of room the program was meant to serve. She had invited every volunteer and organization director who had given or been part of the investigation. About Phyllis and Marcus's director and the directors of the 4 organizations that had quietly stopped submitting partnership applications to the Phoenix Grand. She'd invited Linda Park, who confirmed attendance. She'd invited Gerald Marsh, who also confirmed and asked if he could bring 2 members of the hotel's board. She'd said yes. She'd invited Sandra Coe, who sent her regrets, but mailed a check with a note that said, for what comes next. She had not invited Richard Coleman. That had not been a difficult decision. Before the launch, Madison's phone rang at 8 in the evening. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, then answered. Is this Madison Walker? Yes. My name is Denise Okafor, with a community legal clinic in Tempe. I read about your program through Phyllis Carpenter's network. A pause. I've been wanting to call for about 3 weeks. I kept talking myself out of it because I didn't want to just show up with a list of things we need, Madison said. A short, surprised pause on the other end. like she'd been bracing for more preamble. We have clients, mostly service workers, hourly employees, community volunteers who've experienced sounds like exactly what you're building a framework for. You know, something happened to them. They can describe it, but they have no documentation. One, no understanding of the complaint process, and honestly, there's no confidence that anyone is going to believe them. Denise paused. I have 17 open cases that have stalled because the people involved don't have the organizational support to push them forward. Teen. Madison was quiet for a moment. Come to the launch next Saturday, she said. Anyone you think should hear it. Denise Okafor came. 4 colleagues from the legal clinic and 2 of her clients. By the time the program started, 163 people in a room, designed for 150. Each chair was full. And people were standing along the walls in a particular stance of people who drove across the city on a Saturday morning because something was happening that they didn't want to miss. Jackson stood at the back. He wore his leather vest. He'd been asked by one of the planning committee members gently, indirectly, in the way people sometimes address things they're not sure they have the right to address, whether he was planning to wear the vest or whether he might prefer something more. And here the person had paused, searching for the word, something more appropriate for the setting. And had said, the vest is who I am. If the setting can't accommodate who I am, then that's a different problem. He'd said it pleasantly, without heat. He towed the vest. He wore the Madison, stood at the front of the room with a single index card in her hand. One index card. She'd written 3 words on it, not an outline, not talking points. Just the 3 words she needed to hold on to as an anchor if she felt herself drifting from what she wanted to say. She looked at the room. She saw Phyllis Carpenter in the 3rd row, binder on her lap, expression alert and warm. She saw Marcus near the door, counting chairs, doing the logistics job he'd been doing since 6 that morning. She saw Linda Park and Gerald Marsh toward the middle, Marsh looking slightly out of his element in a room that wasn't his, and carrying the particular composure of Zun, of someone making a genuine effort to sit in that discomfort correctly. She saw Denise Okafor and her colleagues along the left wall. She saw 17 strangers whose names she didn't know yet, who had come because someone had told them something was happening that mattered. She saw her father at the back. He caught her eyes and gave her nothing, no signal, no nod, no visible encouragement. Presence. Just, I'm here. This is yours. She looked back at the room. I want to start by telling you about a woman named Priya, she said. She didn't have a Priya in her notes. The name came to her in the moment because she needed a name for something true. I'm calling her Priya because she asked me not to use her real name. She volunteered at 3 separate institutional events over 2 years. Each one, she was redirected from her assigned position within the first 30 minutes. Each one, she was given an administrative reason. Each one, she went home and wondered if she'd misunderstood something about herself. Madison paused. When she stopped volunteering, not because she wanted to. The message she received every single time was that there was something about her, about what she looked like, about the organization she represented that didn't quite fit the space she'd been invited into. It was very quiet. Priya didn't know she was one of dozens, Madison continued. Thought she was one person having a personal experience. Because that's what this kind of thing does. It makes every individual feel like the problem is individual. They just didn't understand something. Like, the question is about them and not about the system. She looked at the room. It's not about them. It's about the system. And the system can be changed. Can only be changed if the people it failed stop blaming themselves and start documenting what actually happened. She talked for 22 minutes. She talked about the complaint process, about documentation, about what rights volunteers have and how to exercise them, and where to go when the institution's own channels fail. She talked about the program structure, the independent complaint submission portal, the legal referral network, the training curriculum. When still, She talked about what Phyllis had built over 9 years in South Phoenix and what Marcus had understood growing up, watching his grandmother navigate systems that were designed without her in mind. 10. She talked about the 7 volunteers who had sat in a conference room at the Phoenix Grand on a Wednesday night and told the truth about what had happened to them and how that truth he'd accumulated into something that could not be dismissed. She did not talk about Richard Coleman by name. She did not talk about the hotel by name. She did not make the program about a single incident or a single villain, because that was not what the program was about. It was about the structure, the accumulation, the pattern, quiet, consistent, institutionally protected practice of making certain people feel like they had arrived in the wrong room. She finished, was quiet on her moment. Then Phyllis started clapping. Not performatively, the solid, genuine applause of someone who had been waiting for this particular speech for 27 months and was acknowledging that it had finally been given. Followed. Madison looked down at her index card. The words she'd written were, "Not about me." She tucked it in her pocket. Afterward lasted 90 minutes. Denise Okafor asked 3 of them, each more specific than the last, each pushing deeper into operational detail in a way that made Madison understand this woman was going to be part of the organization, whether she'd been formally invited to be yet or not. She asked one question, careful, genuine, about how the independent complaint portal would handle submissions involving his hotel specifically, whether there was a conflict of interest protocol. Madison had thought about this and explained the recusal procedure. Nodded. "Good," he said. "That's the right way to handle it." The room didn't empty the way rooms usually empty after events. They found each other and watched strangers introduce themselves and trade information and recognize shared experiences in the particular way that people do when they've been isolated inside a problem and have suddenly found themselves in a room full. People who understand it from the inside. Caught her eye from across the room and held up 4 fingers. Pointed to his phone. She understood. 4 new signups for the volunteer network in the last 30 minutes. He gave him a thumbs up. Linda Park found her near the refreshment table. The hotel's complaint process officially relaunched Monday, she said. External review panel is in place. Kevin Delgado is leading the internal coordination. Delgado, Madison said. The 26-year-old administrator who did the right thing. Who did the right thing? Linda confirmed. Gerald wanted someone leading it who hadn't been part of the old system. It was the obvious choice. She paused. He asked me to pass along that he's glad something came of what he flagged. Tell him it came of a lot of things, Madison said. Flag was one of them. That matters. Linda nodded. She started to move away, then stopped. Can I ask you something? When you organized those 7 volunteers on the night of the gala, was that planned? Did you go in knowing you were going to do that? Considered the question honestly. I went in knowing my father had taught me that one person's story is a complaint and multiple people's stories are a pattern, she said. No, there were going to be other people with the same story. When I found out there were, I knew what to do with that information. She paused. Well, I guess not planned, but not accidental either. Linda looked at her for a moment. You're going to be remarkable, she said. It wasn't flattery, it was assessment. The particular tone of a person who evaluates people professionally and is reporting a finding. I'm going to be useful, Madison. Mattis said, that's what I'm aiming for. Marsh found Jackson at the back of the room, exactly where he'd been standing for the last 3 hours. Daughter, Marsh said. Yeah, Jackson said, when she was at the front of the room. Tonight, did you want to say something? Add something? Jackson looked at the space where Madison had stood. Nothing? She didn't need anything from me up there, Jackson said. It's hers. He paused. The hardest thing about having a kid who's good at this is figuring out when to step back far enough that they can see how good they actually are. Quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology, he said. Not just for Wednesday night, for the years before it. Nurse agreements we did, I was glad for your foundation's support. Valued the relationship. But I wasn't paying enough attention to whether the people from your foundation were being treated well when they came through our doors. He paused. Should have been. I should. Jackson looked at him. The honest assessment of a man who had decided to be truthful rather than careful. You're paying attention now, Jackson said. I am. It's what matters most going forward. Jackson paused. About the past is only useful if it changes the present. It just sits there. It's just another thing. That's not doing any work. Marsh absorbed that. You're remarkably practical. You've been accused of worse, Jackson said. The room gradually emptied over the next hour. When Denise Okafor was last to leave, exchanged contact information with Madison, Phyllis, because when scheduled a follow-up meeting and identified 3 specific cases she wanted to run through the new complaint documentation system as a pilot. When the door closed behind her, it was just Madison and Jackson and Marcus left in the room. This was stacking chairs with the efficient energy of someone who had been awake since 5:30 and was running on purpose rather than sleep. Madison sat down in one of the remaining chairs. Not collapsing, just sitting, the clean physical surrender of someone who has been standing at full intensity for a long time and can finally let the posture drop. 63 people, Marcus said from across the room. He counted twice. Any problems? Madison asked. 0 problems. People cried during your speech, which I'm counting as a win. He paused. And someone left a business card on the sign-in table that just says Foundation Director and a phone number. Put it in the follow-up pile. Already in the follow-up pile. Sat down in the chair beside Madison. They were quiet together for a moment, the way they'd been quiet in the truck on the way home from the gala, full rather than empty. The silence of 2 people who had been inside something real and were letting it settle. You feel? He asked. Madison thought about it. Actually thought about it. He winced. The way he'd always taught her to, not the reflexive answer, not the social answer, the true one. Like it started, she said. Like tonight was the first day of an actual thing, not just the end of a reaction to something that happened to me. She paused. Is that strange? That I'm more excited than relieved. You know, he said. That's exactly right. She turned to look at him. Doan. In the quiet of the emptied room, she looked at her father, the leather vest, the silver hair, the hands that had rebuilt engines and signed foundation documents, and held her at 10 years old when the first person had told her at school that her family was the wrong kind of people. The hands that had taught her by their consistent action. That character was demonstrated in what you did when it cost you something. Keep thinking about what you told me when this started, she said. The gala. About how removing one person doesn't change anything if the same thinking remains. I think tonight was the start of addressing the thinking, she said. Just one person, not one hotel, the actual thinking that makes people like Coleman able to operate for 11 years because everyone around him was moving too fast or not paying enough attention or just didn't think it was their problem. She paused. And make it everyone's problem in the right way. Is the way where people understand that the volunteer who got sent to the East Wing when she belonged in the main room, that's their problem too, even if they never met her. And was quiet for a long moment. You know what the hardest part of this work is going to be, he said. The days when nothing moves. The days when you send emails and don't get responses. Then when a process stalls, when an institution makes all the right noises and then does nothing. When someone who promised to help suddenly can't make the meeting. He paused. Those days are going to come, and they're going to feel like the work isn't real. It is, he said. You just have to hold on to that on the days when it doesn't feel like it. He nodded. She was writing that down in her head. The way she wrote things down when she didn't have a notebook, encoding them precisely, filing them where she'd be able to find them when she needed them. I'll call you on those days, she said. I'll pick up, he said. Time. The twist that came 3 weeks later was not dramatic. Arrived, as most genuinely significant things do, quietly and from an unexpected direction. Richard Coleman called the Foundation's main line. The number from the program's new website. Madison had insisted the website be live before the launch, and it was clean and clear, and with a phone number on every page. He'd called on a Tuesday afternoon and spoken to the foundation's office coordinator, a woman named Rhonda, who had worked with Jackson for 6 years and had a particular talent for taking information without reacting to it. He told Madison about the call that evening. He said he wanted to speak to whoever was appropriate, Rhonda reported. He didn't ask for your father specifically. He didn't ask for you specifically. He said he'd been reading about the program and wanted to understand what it was doing. A pause sounded. She stopped. What? Madison said. He sounded like someone who'd been up for a while, Rhonda said carefully. Threatening. Not performing. Just tired. Madison sat with this information for 2 days. She talked to her father about it on the second day. Not asking permission, asking what he thought, which was a different thing. You want to talk to him? Jackson asked. I don't know. She was honest about it. Methinks there's nothing he can say that changes anything. The investigation documented what happened. The program is being built. Presence or absence in the story doesn't alter the facts. It's true. But, she paused. The whole point of what we're building is that accountability should create the possibility of understanding, just consequences. And if I refuse to talk to him when he reaches out, not to negotiate, not to defend himself, just to try to understand what he actually did, then I'm saying the understanding only runs one way. Madison was quiet. Which maybe it does, she said. I don't know. I'm not sure it's my responsibility to facilitate his understanding. Not your responsibility, Jackson said. But it might be your choice. He thought about that distinction for another day. She called Rhonda and said, tell him I'll talk to him. 20 minutes by phone. The call happened on a Thursday morning. Coleman sounded the way Rhonda had described, tired, careful, stripped of the managed authority that had characterized every previous exchange. He ended by saying he wasn't calling to dispute anything, in the investigation report. He appreciated that, not because it was generous, but because it saved them from spending the whole 20 minutes on facts they both already knew. About the program, he said. Online, okay. About volunteers, not knowing they have documentation rights. A pause, thinking about that. About the fact that part of why it worked what I was doing was because people didn't know they could push back, accepted the administrative language, because they didn't have any framework for identifying it as something other than administration. One Madison said, I knew that, he said. Silence. Consciously, he said, I didn't sit down and strategize, but some part of me understood that it would be accepted. The language I was using would be, he stopped, tried again, that certain people would doubt themselves before they'd question me. Said nothing. She let him sit in what he just said. I don't know what to do with that, he said. I'm not asking you to tell me. I just needed to say it to someone who'd actually know if it was true. She thought about what her father had said about certain conversations not being possible until a person was ready to have them. About performance versus honesty. About the difference between a man calculating exposure and a man beginning to actually look at himself. It's true, she said, and saying it to me doesn't resolve it. She paused. But it's a more honest place to start than where you were 6 weeks ago. Actually starting. I don't know if I am, he said, trying to figure out if I know how. That's an honest answer, she said. 20 minutes ended, and she let them end. She didn't extend the call. She didn't offer reassurance or a framework or a path forward, giving him the truth, and she'd let him keep it. She sat at the kitchen table afterward and turned her phone face down and looked at the wall for a while. Then she opened her laptop and went back to the document she'd been working on, the training curriculum draft, the section on how volunteers could recognize and record institutional redirection in real time. She'd been working on the language for 3 days, trying to make it specific enough to be useful and accessible enough to work for a 20-year-old who'd never filed a formal complaint. She had 6 pages. She needed 12. She started writing. Jackson came through the kitchen an hour later with himself, coffee, at his daughter at the table. The focused eyes, the way her hands moved on the keyboard, the particular quality of energy she had when she was inside something that was real and didn't interrupt her. He sat at the other end of the table with his coffee. and a parts catalog he needed to review. And they worked in the same room in the same silence they'd always shared. The easy parallel quiet of two people who understood each other completely and didn't need to fill the space between them with noise. This was who they were. This was what they had built. Not despite everything the world had decided about them before knowing them, but straight through it, on the other side of it, being the weight of it, and refusing to let it determine the destination. 40 miles away, 4 community organizations that had quietly removed the Phoenix Grand from their partnership lists sent applications to reinstate their relationships with the hotel's new community engagement program, the one that Linda Park had built with external oversight, an independent complaint review panel, and a protocol that Kevin Delgado managed with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what happened when processes failed people. Signed the first 5 volunteers from Denise Okafor's legal clinic into the training program on a Friday. He texted Madison about it. At noon, 5 confirmed. Session Tuesday. She texted back, make sure they know they can call the line anytime, before, during, or after an event. He sent back, already told them. He asked, who built the program? I said you did. They asked how old you were. I said 19. Nobody believed me. She smiled at her phone. Then she set it face down and kept writing. 3 months after the launch, the program had trained 68 volunteers from 11 organizations, processed 9 formal complaint submissions through its independent portal, 3 of which had resulted in formal institutional responses, and added 4 new partner organizations from counties outside Maricopa. Phyllis Carpenter presented at a statewide nonprofit conference. The presentation was titled, When the System Routes to the Problem, Documenting Institutional Discrimination in Community Partnership Events. She cited the Phoenix Grand investigation throughout, did not mention Richard Coleman by name. She mentioned Madison Walker by name 7 times. Madison was in the audience. She'd driven 2 hours to be there and was sitting in the 4th row with a notebook on her knee. Phyllis looked at her at one point during the presentation and said everyone to the full conference room, when I submitted a complaint 18 months ago and received no response, I thought the work wasn't worth continuing. Then a 19-year-old girl with a notebook organized 7 people in 2 hours at a charity gala and reminded me that the work is always worth continuing. You just have to find the people who agree. The room applauded. Madison looked down at her notebook. She wrote, find the people who agree. Then she looked up at the room, the program directors, the organization leaders, the attorneys and advocates, and exhausted community workers who had driven from across the state to sit in a conference center on a weekday and try to do the work better. And she understood the clarity that sat in her chest like something solid and warm and permanent, that she was in exactly the right room because anyone had finally decided she belonged, because she had built the room herself. And the door was open to everyone who had ever been told they didn't fit the space they'd been invited to. Every volunteer sent to the East Wing, every feedback form closed in 4 words, the person who went home, wondering quietly if they'd misunderstood something about themselves. It was the same for all of them. They hadn't misunderstood anything. And now there was someone who would make sure the record reflected that permanently, specifically, and without apology. What Jackson Walker had spent 20 years building toward Denton. Not the moment when the world stopped judging people by the wrong things, when the people being judged, but the moment the people being stopped waiting for the world's permission to matter, stood up in the rooms they'd been excluded from and built something so undeniable that the exclusion itself became the thing on trial. His daughter had reached that moment at 19 years old. The work she had started would outlast every system that had ever tried to tell her where she belonged. It's not a possibility. That was a certainty, the kind that doesn't ask for agreement, doesn't wait for approval, and has already begun.